Hi everybody, this is Sarah Red, your instructor, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about the molecules of life, which involves a little bit of basic chemistry. And I wanted to make a video because this is a topic that sometimes people struggle to understand. And first of all, you might be thinking, okay, this is a biology class, why do we need to know any chemistry? So I put this picture here because this right here is one of the enzymes. It's a type of protein, really large molecule called an enzyme that is involved in breaking down your food for energy. And with an enzyme, there are these proteins that have a very specific shape in one part of them that we call the active site. And this active site has to be exactly the right shape to fit with the molecules that we call the reactants that it's going to help break down or build up. In this case, we're thinking about your food molecules. So basically what happens is the food molecules that get absorbed into your system have to move into this active site of that enzyme, and they have to be exactly the right shape to bump in and fit into that active site. And then the enzyme can squish them around in ways that make it much easier and faster to break them down for energy. If you didn't have these enzymes that are exactly the right shape to fit with your food, it would take thousands of years for you to break down food for energy, and you would be long dead by then. Your cells would completely run out. So the shapes of molecules are super important for what they can do. Receptors on the outsides of your cells also have a very specific, almost like a lock fitting into with a specific key, that kind of a shape specificity, which allows a hormone, for example, to fit with a particular receptor on one kind of cell but not on another, which is why hormones like estrogen and testosterone affect some parts of the body more than others, because certain parts of the body have certain receptors. So ultimately, the point of this is that the shape or structure determines the function of a particular molecule. So then beyond that, we got to think about, how do we know what kind of a structure something is going to have chemically? How do we determine what shape an enzyme like this is going to have? And ultimately, it results from the chemical bonds. So the chemical bonds determine the structure or shape of a particular molecule. And then beyond that, how do we know what kinds of chemical bonds something is going to have? There's multiple different kinds. So ultimately, it's the electrons that determine the type of chemical bonds. So we're going to talk a bit more about each of these things, but I wanted to introduce this so you know why it's important. We're learning about electrons and chemical bonds because that determines the shape of a molecule, which ultimately determines what that molecule can do inside your body or inside of any living thing. So now that we know why electrons are important, let's look at what an electron is. So this whole drawing here is an atom, and an electron is part of an atom. Atoms have three major types of what we call subatomic particles. And the three types are protons, and they have a positive charge. We've got neutrons, and they have a neutral or no charge. And then we've got electrons, and they are negative. And you may notice also that the protons and neutrons are in the center of the atom. We call them part of the nucleus. And the electrons are around the outside. And they are much smaller. They have hardly any mass. Now, ultimately, since the protons and neutrons, they're in the middle, they might make up most of the atomic mass. You can see that in this particular atom, there's 2 protons and 2 neutrons and 2 electrons. That's not always going to be the case. The number of protons determines what element something is. This determines the element. So in this particular one with 2 protons, this is an atom of the helium element. Elements are like basic ingredients for everything. And if it got another proton and had 3, it would then turn into lithium. It would be a different element. So the number of protons determines the element. The neutrons, there can be different numbers even within the same element. So helium doesn't always have to have 2 neutrons. It could have 3 or 1. There's different possible numbers of neutrons, and this determines what we call the isotope. So an isotope of helium with 1 neutron would be slightly different than an isotope of helium with a different number of neutrons. The electrons, they're negative, and they determine the bonding behavior. So we already said before that the function of something depends on its structure, and the structure depends on the type of chemical bond. Well, now you see that the electrons determine the bonding behavior. Alright, so now we know what protons, neutrons, and electrons are. How do you figure out how many of them something has? So if you look at this is the periodic table. You've probably seen it before. And you probably want to either have one printed out for reference for you or have it bookmarked or something on your computer, because we'll be referencing this a bit. If you want to know how many protons something has, you want to look in this periodic table and find the symbol for that element. And generally the largest number in the periodic table next to that element is going to be the atomic number, which is the number of protons. And I guess this messed up. So your atomic number is equal to the number of protons for that element. So you can see in here, let's make this thinner, the atomic numbers for a bunch of things. So right here, you got the atomic number for B stands for boron, it's 5. It's right up there. And for beryllium, it's 4. So atomic number, number of protons. Normally, an atom that has a neutral charge is going to have the same number of protons as it has electrons. So as long as your atom doesn't have a charge like a plus or a minus next to it, you can assume that the number of protons is the same as the number of electrons. So if I just asked you how many electrons a neutral carbon atom had, you would look for the number of protons, and for carbon it is 6, right there. And then you can assume that it also has 6 electrons, since I said it's a neutral atom. Now, there are 4 of these elements that we're going to be paying the most attention to in here. And because they make up over 96% of your body weight, hugely important in all living things, and those 4 are carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen. Oxygen actually makes up about 65% of your body weight, which seems a little odd when you think that oxygen is in the air and air is light, but remember that water is made of H2O, and so most of that oxygen in your body comes from water. So now let's take a look at how people give you information about an atom when they aren't looking specifically at the periodic table. So let's say that somebody doesn't want to draw the whole periodic table on the page. So then it's going to depend on the arrangement of these numbers. So if you've got something in the top left, that's going to be your mass number. The mass number is equal to the number of protons plus the number of neutrons in a particular atom. You can't get the mass number from the periodic table because, as we said, the same element could have different numbers of neutrons. So this is just saying this one particular carbon atom has 14 protons plus neutrons. Then we can see the atomic number is down here underneath at the lower left corner, and that again was the number of protons, which is usually equal to the number of electrons as long as there's no positive or negative sign next to that symbol. So if you wanted to figure out the number of neutrons in this particular carbon, what you would do is you would take the mass number and you would subtract the atomic number. So in this case, you got 14 minus 6, and you would end up with 8 neutrons. People don't always write both numbers at once, so maybe somebody just wants to tell you about the protons, so they would show you right there that oxygen has an atomic number of 8. It has that many protons. Or hydrogen has 1 proton. Or maybe right now they're only telling you about the mass number because they only care about the isotope. So they might tell you that this is nitrogen 15, meaning it has 15 protons plus neutrons. So now we really get to the meat of this, which is the electrons. And again, the electrons are going to determine the types of bonds something can make, which determines its shape, which determines its function and what it can do in a living thing. And electrons have different amounts of potential energy. Potential energy is energy that something has because of its location or structure. And we can't really draw potential energy because it's just an ability to do work. So instead, we draw what we call an electron shell. So in the case of hydrogen, it has just 1 electron, which means it's just going to have 1 electron shell. And I'm going to draw that 1 electron as orange because electrons have energy, and orange reminds me of like lightning bolts and energy. And basically that shell is not a physical object around the actual hydrogen atom. It's just a way to represent how much energy that electron has. Now, it turns out that that first electron shell can hold up to 2 electrons. So if we get to something, if we're doing an element that has more than 2 electrons, like let's say oxygen, which has 8 as its atomic number, then we're going to have more than 1 electron shell. So for oxygen, we can put 2 electrons, up to 2, on that first shell, but since it has more electrons than that, we got to add a second electron shell. And the electrons on the second shell are going to have a higher amount of potential energy. So oxygen has 6 more electrons. Turns out all of these 6 can go on that second shell because the second shell can hold up to 8 electrons. But let's say we've got something that has more than 8 electrons, like let's say chlorine. If you look up chlorine in the table, its atomic number is 17. So we'll still start with the first shell as usual. It can hold up to 2. The second shell can hold up to 8, so we'll put 8 on there. But chlorine has 17 electrons, so it still has 7 left. So we're going to have to add a third shell. And it turns out the third shell can also hold up to 8 electrons. So we'll draw a third shell in there. These electrons will have even more potential energy. And there are 7 left, so they can all fit on this third shell. Sorry for my bad electron drawings. Now, if we were to have a fourth shell, the fourth shell could hold up to 18. And we won't have any elements that we're talking about in this class that go beyond 4 shells. But ultimately, the ones on the outer shell have more potential energy than those on the inner shells. And you add shells as needed based on the number of electrons. Now, the outer shell for any particular atom is going to be called the valence shell. And atoms are always going to try to fill up their valence shell. And that's what ultimately results in chemical bonds. As an atom exchanges electrons with another atom to gain or lose some or share some with something else, it's trying to get a full valence shell. So right now you can see that the valence or outer shell for oxygen is the second shell. It's only got 2, so the second shell is the outer one, which means it has 6 valence electrons. The outer shell for hydrogen is just the first one. It only has 1 shell and it has 1 valence electron. And the outer shell for chlorine is the third shell and it has 7 valence electrons on it. Now, ultimately, your atom is going to try to gain or lose the smallest number of electrons possible in order to fill up this valence shell. So, if you gained electrons, you just try and fill up the shell that you've got. So for any of these ones right here, for oxygen right here, it's got 6 on the valence shell. It would need to gain 2 to fill up that valence shell. Chlorine has 7 on the valence shell, so it only needs 1 to get it to its max number of 8 and fill up that valence shell. So let's take a look at these two elements here. So we've got sodium with the symbol Na, and it's got an atomic number of 11. So we start out with 11 electrons on that. Chlorine, Cl, has 17 electrons to start out with. And you can see that the sodium only has 1 electron on its valence shell, and it wants to get a full valence shell. So if it was to add electrons to fill up that valence shell, it would have to get 7 more electrons, and that's a lot. So it turns out that what's easier is that the sodium can lose this 1 electron off of its outer shell, and then that shell will completely go away, and it will be left with a full valence shell underneath. Now, in order to do this, in reality, that electron that it lost can't just go off into nowhere. It's got to give it to somebody. So sodium needs to find something that wants an extra electron and give that electron away. So here we've got an example. Chlorine over here has 7 electrons in its outer shell, so it only needs 1 more. So what happens is the sodium can give away this 1 electron on its outer shell to the chlorine. Now chlorine's got a full valence shell. The shell goes away, and sodium now has a full valence shell as well. So both of them are full. They're both happy. This is great. But it turns out, remember that originally the proton number was the same as the electron number, but now that we've changed the electrons, they're not the same anymore. So our sodium had an atomic number of 11. It has 11 protons, but it doesn't have 11 electrons anymore. It's got fewer. So since it has more positive protons than negative electrons, it gets a plus charge on it. It's got more positives than negatives. And since the chlorine just gained an extra electron, now it's got more negatives than positives, so it gets a minus charge on it. Any atom with a positive or negative charge is called an ion, and specifically a positively charged ion is called a cation, and a negatively charged ion is called an anion. And ultimately, if you have a cation and an anion that are in the same general area, could bump into each other, they will stick together. Positives and negatives like to stick together, just like the positive part of one magnet likes to stick to the negative part of another magnet. So when a positive cation sticks to a negative anion, that is called an ionic bond. So ionic bond is an attraction between a cation and an anion. So let's show you a couple other examples. Let's say that we have some aluminum. Aluminum, you could look it up in the table. Its atomic number is 13. And let's say that we've also got some fluorine. Atomic number of 9. So our aluminum is going to need 1, 2, 3 shells. And the fluorine is going to need 2 shells. So let's grab a different color. So both of them can get 2 in the first shell. Then the aluminum can get a full second shell of 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And that makes 10 total. It's got 13, so it needs 3 more. So we'll put 3 more in this outer shell. For the fluorine, it has 9 total, so the first shell can hold up to 2. And there's 7 left to go in this second shell. Alright, so aluminum could either gain 5 to fill up this outer shell, or it could lose 3 and then have that whole outer shell go away. So whichever is the smallest number is generally what it's going to do. So aluminum is going to lose 3. And this fluorine only needs to gain 1. So the aluminum can give 1 of its extra electrons to the fluorine. I'm going to make that a smaller arrow. Oops. Gives 1 extra electron to the fluorine, so now that fluorine is full. So what about the 2 other extra electrons? What are we going to do with those? Well, you would need some more fluorines. So if we have another fluorine down here, I'm not going to draw all the shells, but we could give a second electron to that fluorine. And if we have a third fluorine, we'll just go with this one up here. We give the third electron to that fluorine. And then our aluminum would lose the outer shell and be completely full, and each of the 3 fluorines would be full. Now in that case, since aluminum lost 3 of its negatives, it has 3 extra positives compared to negatives. So it's going to get a charge of 3 plus and be a cation. And the fluorine, since each of them gained 1 extra electron, each of the 3 fluorines is going to have a minus charge next to it. Now if you wanted to draw this in a shorter way, what you can do is you can just write the symbols next to each other, Al and F, and since there had to be 3 fluorines for every 1 aluminum, I'm going to put a number 3 after the fluorine. In our case over here, we had 1 sodium and 1 chlorine, so we don't have to put any numbers after them if they're just 1s. If we had an element that gained 2 electrons, it would get a 2 minus charge. Let's give some examples of things that give different charges. So O gains 2 electrons because it needs to gain 2 to get full. So O would get a 2 minus charge. N needs to gain 3, so it would get a 3- charge. Magnesium needs to lose 2, so it would get a 2+ charge. So ultimately, if you lose your electrons, you have more positives than negatives. If you gain electrons, you have more negatives than positives. So besides ionic bonds, there are 2 more important kinds of bonds we're going to talk about in here, and that's covalent bonds and hydrogen bonds. Ionic bonds were forming between atoms that one of them needed to gain electrons and the other needed to lose. Covalent bonds are going to happen when atoms share electrons and they both need to gain the same amount. So let's do an example. So let's say we've got hydrogen here. Hydrogen has 1 electron, so 1 shell, meaning it needs 1 more electron to fill up that shell. So what can happen is it can get together with another hydrogen atom that also has 1 electron and needs to gain 1. And ultimately these two can scoot really close together and share their electrons. So that those 2 electrons are going around both of the hydrogen atoms. So that's called a covalent bond. Let's do another example. We'll put this one over here. Let's say that we've got oxygen. And oxygen's atomic number is 8. So it's going to have we got 2 electrons in the first shell, 6 in the next shell. Now it could share with another oxygen that needs 2, or it could share with 2 things that need 1. Ultimately it needs 2, so it's got to find other stuff that needs to get 2, either 1 thing that needs 2 or 2 things that need 1. So let's say there's some hydrogen around. We already saw that the hydrogen needed 1. So what can happen is the hydrogen can come over here and share its 1 electron with the oxygen, and oxygen shares that one back, and these 2 electrons will go around both that hydrogen and the oxygen. So now this hydrogen has 2 in that shell, and the first shell holds only 2, so that one's full. The oxygen has in its outer shell 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it still needs 1 more. So if there's another hydrogen around, or something else that just needs 1, the other one can share its electron with this extra one. So that one's coming from oxygen, this one's coming from hydrogen, and they are sharing those 2. If eventually, as you kind of understand what's happening, you end up wanting to draw this in a shorter way. So there's a few shorter ways to draw things like this. One of them is called a structural formula. And in a structural formula, what you do is you only draw dots for the outer shell electrons first. So oxygen had 6 in the outer shell. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then hydrogen had 1, and the other hydrogen also had 1. And then you make a line between the ones that are sharing. So now we have this line, each line is representing 2 shared electrons. Another way to draw this is called a molecular formula, and this is the shortest way and kind of what we saw with the ionic bonds. And that's where we put the letters for both the elements, And then we put numbers after any that there's more than one of. So since we have 2 hydrogen atoms, put a 2 after the H. And there's only 1 oxygen, so it doesn't need a number. So this is H2O, is the molecular formula. Let's try another example. Let's say we have some carbon. Carbon's atomic number is 6. And so it's going to have 2 electrons in the first shell, 4 left in the second shell. Now, we didn't really mention this before, but with something like carbon, it's got to gain or lose the same number either way. It's gaining 4 would fill up this outer shell, losing 4 would make this shell go away. If it's the same number either way, most of the time it's going to gain. So with carbon, you can assume it's always going to try to gain 4. So we could either get like 4 hydrogens and each of them could share 1 with it. We could get 2 oxygens where each of them could share 2 with it. Let's try it a little bit of both ways. So we'll put an oxygen over here. It has 8. So we had 2 in the first shell, and we're going to have some overlapping in this second shell. And our second shell for oxygen started with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that one was from the carbon over there. So oxygen needs to gain 2, carbon needs to gain 4. So oxygen's the limiting factor, it needs to gain fewer. So oxygen is going to share 2 with the carbon, and carbon will share 2 of its own electrons back. So let's move some of the electrons around. Erase those ones. Erase those ones. So the carbon will put 2 of its electrons over here in the sharing space, and oxygen I erased 2, so I'm going to move those ones over here to the sharing space. So now oxygen's sharing 2 with carbon, carbon's sharing 2 back. And if we counted all the electrons, we can see that carbon, or we'll start with oxygen. Oxygen's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 that count for its outer shell, because the shared ones count for both. Carbon has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 that count for its outer shell. So it still needs 2 more. So we got to find other stuff to share with. So we could share with another oxygen. If that's around, we could share with 2 hydrogens. Let's do that. So hydrogen has 1 to share with carbon, and carbon shares 1 back. And another hydrogen up here will share its 1 with carbon, and carbon will share 1 back. So now the hydrogens each have 2. First shell only holds 2, so they're full. And the carbon has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 in its outer shell. So carbon's full too now. So let's try drawing this in the other way. So the structural formula, generally we start out and we do the dots for the number in the valence shell. So we had 4 in the valence shell. And then we had our oxygen over here, which had 6 in the valence shell. And we had a hydrogen and another hydrogen. And now we connect the dots that are sharing. So 1 line there, 1 line there, 1 there, and 1 there. Since there's 2 lines between the carbon and the oxygen, we call that a double bond. They're sharing 2 pairs of electrons instead of just 1. And if we were writing this in our molecular formula way, we've got C, H, and O. And I'm not going to take points off if you put them in a different order or anything. C there's only one of, so it doesn't get a number. H there were two of. And O there was one, so it's CH2O would be your molecular formula. So that's covalent bonds. You can have up to a triple bond, but you cannot have a quadruple bond. Alright, a little bit more detail about our covalent bonds. Covalent bonds can be what we call polar or nonpolar. And polar and nonpolar are based on a quality called electronegativity. Electronegativity is basically how attractive an atom is to electrons. And of our four most important elements for life, the most electronegative or most attractive one is oxygen. Next most attractive is nitrogen. Third is carbon. And fourth is hydrogen. So the electrons really like oxygen a lot. Hydrogen, it's that smelly guy over in the corner, and they don't like him so much. Ultimately, if two of these atoms are sharing and they have very similar electronegativities, they're going to share the electrons equally, and that's called a nonpolar bond. Of these four, C and H, they tend to be close enough in their attractiveness that they're going to share the electrons equally, make nonpolar bonds. Also, if you have two of the same thing sharing, they're going to be equal. So if you have two oxygens sharing with each other, they're going to share equally because they're both oxygens. They're equally attractive to electrons. But if you have something like oxygen sharing with hydrogen, the electrons like the oxygen a heck of a lot more than the hydrogen. And so the oxygen is going to sort of pull the electrons toward itself, and they're going to go around the oxygen more often than the hydrogen. So if we had something like H2O, basically the electrons are getting pulled towards this oxygen. They're going around the oxygen more often than around the hydrogen. And because of that, since electrons are negative, the oxygen's going to get a little partial negative charge. So that funny little symbol is a lowercase Greek letter delta, and it means a partial charge. It didn't get a whole electron because the electron still occasionally goes around the hydrogen, but it goes around the oxygen more, so it's partially negative. And since the electrons are going around the hydrogens less, they're less negative, so they get a partial positive charge on both of them. Whereas if you had something like CH4, since the C and the H's share equally, we're not going to put any partial charges on any of those. They all share equally. So this guy over here is polar. You think of the polar one, something pulls the electrons towards itself. And this one over here is nonpolar. Polar molecules have partial charges, nonpolar do not have partial charges. So when you have two polar molecules that are in the same area, they are attracted to each other based on their partial charges. So like let's say we got two water molecules in here. So here's some H2O. And we said the O is more attractive to electrons, so it gets a little negative, and these hydrogens get a little positive. And let's say there's another water molecule around. And this guy's got a little partial negative, and these guys have partial positives. What will happen is that there will be a hydrogen bond that will form in between the partial positive and the partial negative. So the hydrogen here would be somewhat attracted to that partial negative oxygen. And we draw these hydrogen bonds with a dotted line because they are weak bonds. They're not very strong. It's pretty easy to break them apart since it's not even a whole positive attracted to a whole negative. Other kinds of things that could be polar, NH3 is a reasonably common one. So let's say we've got nitrogen over here with 3 hydrogens on it. If you remember that our ONCH was in order from the most electronegative to the least electronegative, you can see that the nitrogen is more electronegative than the hydrogen, so it's the one that's going to pull the electrons, and it's going to get the partial negative charge on it. The hydrogens are the least electronegative, the electrons don't like them, so they're going to get partially positive. Apologize for my bad drawings. This is not a very good touchscreen. And so then the partial negative of that nitrogen could be attracted to the partial positive of this hydrogen on the water molecule. So weak bonds, dotted lines, they do end up being pretty important. It's kind of like how Velcro is weak, but if you had a huge sheet of Velcro stuck to another huge sheet of Velcro, if you've ever seen people like wearing Velcro suits and they can stick to the wall or something, hydrogen bonds are like that. You can have a ton of them built up together and it can ultimately end up holding a molecule's shape together. And this is actually what holds the strands of DNA together, is hydrogen bonds. So let's compare our bonds a little bit as far as their strength. So we have 3 different types of bonds. We've got the covalent bonds are the strongest, turns out. Most of the molecules inside of living cells are covalent, the ones that last long anyway. Next would be our ionic bonds. They're middle strength. They are pretty strong in air, but they come apart in water. And since cells and living things tend to have high water content, they tend to be a lot weaker than covalent when they're inside of living things. And then our hydrogen bonds are the weakest. And if we were just going to summarize them a little bit too, remember that covalent bonds involve atoms that need to gain electrons. And electrons were just E- is the abbreviation, are going to share to fill their outer shells. And with the ionic bonds, we said atoms will transfer electrons, which means some are going to gain and others are going to lose to fill their valence shells. And then our hydrogen bonds are the weakest, and we said these are when the partial positive sticks to the partial negative on 2 polar molecules. That's kind of our summary of our bond characteristics. So one of the most important characteristics of these bonds is based on whether they're going to dissolve in water or not, because that's going to determine whether they can get into your cells. And sometimes if you're developing like a new drug molecule for medicine and you need it to get into a cell, sometimes the delivery system and getting the drug to get it to the right part of the body is harder than developing the drug in the first place. So ultimately, similar things will dissolve in similar things. So we use this phrase, like dissolves like. And basically what this means is things with a charge will dissolve in other things with a charge. Things with no charge will dissolve in other things that have no charge. So if you think about our 3 kinds of bonds, the bonds with charge. that would be your ionic bonds. They had a whole charge. And then we also had polar covalent bonds. Those ones had partial charges. And then bonds with no charge would be the nonpolar covalent bonds. Hydrogen bonds involved two polar molecules sticking together, so they go where the polar things go. Now if we think about water and what kind of bonds water has, we showed a bunch of pictures of water. It has polar covalent bonds, which means it's got a charge. So if you're thinking about things that dissolve in water, it would be anything that has a charge. So ionic bonds, or anything that has polar covalent bonds. So there's a word for that. The word hydrophilic means water-loving. That means things that dissolve in water. And again, that's anything that's got a charge. Since water's polar, it's got a charge. Other things with a charge will dissolve in water. Things that are the opposite would be hydrophobic. That means water-fearing. Those things don't dissolve in water easily. Things like oils and fats. If you think about bonds with no charge, basically you can hypothesize that oils and fats would have bonds with no charge, which are the nonpolar covalent bonds. So the last thing I wanted to cover here is how do you tell what kind of bond something has if you don't know? And I think there are some problems like this on your chemistry worksheet. So let's start out with an example. Let's start out with lithium fluoride. So the first thing you should do is look up the atomic numbers in the periodic table. So for lithium, it would be 3, and for fluorine, it would be 9. Then you need to figure out, are they going to gain or lose electrons to get a full outer shell? So for the lithium, it's got 2 in the first shell, 1 in the second shell. If there's 1 in the second shell, if you either lose that 1 or gain 7, losing 1's a lot easier than gaining a whole 7. So this one is going to lose. And for the fluorine, it has 9, so that means 2 in the first shell, 7 in the second shell. 7 in the second shell, so it could either lose 7 or gain 1. Gaining 1 is a lot lower, it's easier to do, so this one's going to gain. If one thing loses and one thing gains, they're going to make an ionic bond. If we said ionic, you're going to transfer, and some things are going to gain and some will lose. So we're done. We figured that one out. So let's do another example. Let's say we're going to do N2. So again, first we look up the atomic number, and for nitrogen it's 7. And there's just 2 nitrogens, and so they're both going to do the same thing. It's got 2 in the first shell, 5 in the second shell. It's going to either lose all 5 or gain 3. 3 is the lower number, so it's going to gain 3. Since they're both nitrogens, they're both going to gain 3. And when 2 things both gain, it's covalent. If it's covalent, you got to figure out if it's polar or non-polar. So is either of those nitrogens going to pull the electrons harder than the other one? Well, since they're both the same thing, they're going to have equal amounts of hold on the electrons. So they're not going to pull harder than the other one. So they're non-polar. Let's try another one. Let's go with NH3. So we look up the atomic numbers. N is 7, H is 1, N we already said had to gain 3 just now, and H only has 1 in the outer shell, so that could either gain that 1 or lose that 1. When it's same number either way, we said it resorts usually to gain, so it's going to gain as well. So when both of them gain, it's covalent. And then we got to figure out polar or non-polar covalent. Are they going to share equally or unequally? So our order of electronegativities was ONCH, with O being the most strong electronegative and H being the least. And we said C and H shared equally, but everything else pretty much is going to share unequally. So N and H, they're going to be pretty different. So N is going to pull a lot harder than the H, and it's going to be polar covalent. I'm going to show you one that's an exception to our normal ONCH, what we think about, and that is CO2. So let's start out just like we did before. Look up in the periodic table. C is 6, H is O, or O is 8. C has 4 in its outer shell, so that could gain or lose 4, but we said when it's the same either way, it's going to gain. O has 2 in the first shell, 6 in the second shell, so it's going to gain 2. If they both gain, it is covalent. And looking at our ONCH, looks like the C and O are pretty different electronegativities, which is true. So they should be polar covalent, but this is a little bit of a weird one. Because of its shape, turns out if you draw it, CO2 looks kind of like this. And again, that the oxygen is more electronegative, so they get the negative, and the C gets the positive. But it turns out that if the negatives and positives are, if the negatives are equally and opposite pulling away from the positive, so the positive's right in the middle here, that they kind of canceled each other out. And so all the charges cancel each other out and make that particular one non-polar. I know that's confusing, but it's the only exception to this that you're going to have to deal with. CO2 is a very important molecule in living things, so we should know that it is nonpolar. So you'll just have to remember that for CO2. CO2 is nonpolar, even though it looks like it should be polar. Hopefully this helps get you through your chemistry work and understand it a little bit better. Feel free to post your questions on the water cooler board.